Friends, here we are on the eve of Easter, so I thought I'd share a little bit about an Easter of more than 50 years ago that's still making itself felt. But before I do, I want to do just a little bit of a song that you'll probably understand more about at the end of the video. How a kite climbs in the wind the morning that the girls slept in. Dark hail drew 5 to 10. How the rooster met his end. Tell me, tell me, tell me. Well, to get back to that Easter of more than 50 years ago, put the guitar over here. We have to go back even further than that, to November 17th, 1948, when I was born. My mother, Hazel Norris Flannery, whom many of you know, was a school teacher. She taught home economics. And from what I've heard, she taught right up very near, I think within about a week of the time I was born. And then, after I was born, she went back to teaching after about 6 weeks, because in those days there was no maternal leave and my parents needed the money. So what to do with this newborn baby while they were both at school? Well, they found a woman, I think her name was Mrs. Woolams, and they would take me to her in the morning on the way to school and drop me off. But apparently I hated this woman. I would just throw a tremendous fit every time they'd try to leave me with her. And whether she was mean to me or I just didn't like her, we don't know, but it concerned my parents quite a bit, and they were caught in a quandary of what to do for child care. Well, my mother, Hazel, shared this with her mother, Elizabeth Martin, my Grandma Martin. And as soon as Grandma Martin heard that, she said in no uncertain terms, "I'll take care of that baby." So she left her home in Irving, she was a widow, and came to live with us in McKee and stayed there for several years. Now, Grandma Martin was a remarkable person, and in my eyes and in the eyes of most who knew her, a wonderful person. She had a bubbly, happy personality and a very can-do attitude. I remember one morning after she had been there a few years, Daddy got up and our electricity was off. It had gone off, as that happens sometimes, and we had an electric stove, and he came in and said, "Well, we'll have to eat cold cereal today. We don't have any electric." And Granny Martin hollered from the kitchen, "Well, y'all come in here, I've got hot breakfast for you." We went in the kitchen and she had fried eggs and bacon and toast. And Daddy, he called her by her last name, Martin. He said, "Martin, how did you do this with no electricity?" And she laughed. She said, "We've got a coal furnace in the basement. I went down there and cooked it on the coal furnace." And we enjoyed that hot breakfast. And Granny Martin enjoyed it, but I think she enjoyed it more just by watching us enjoy it. Well, that was the kind of person that she was. And we'll jump forward a little bit to when I got to be about 4.5 years old. A threatening wind began to blow into the house, and Grandma Martin wasn't there as much as she used to be. And then a strange man named Alfred Moore started coming around, and Grandma Martin was gone even more. And then I learned somehow that Grandma Martin and Alfred, who was a widower, were going to be married, and that she was going to move from McKee to Annville, 12 miles away, and not live with us anymore. Well, I hadn't thought much about Alfred at first, but when I learned that, I began to dislike him intensely. And about 2 days after I heard that she was getting married, Grandma Martin and I were up in the McKee walking up the sidewalk past Wicker's department store toward Begley's drugstore, and I was holding her hand. And apparently in those days, I was pretty direct, and I just stopped and I looked up at her and I said, "Do you love Alfred better or me?" And Grandma Martin, she looked around just a little bit and she said, "You, but don't tell Alfred." Well, that was all I needed to hear. I could deal with that. I still didn't like her leaving our home, but I could handle it. And I never felt it necessary to share that confidence with Alfred, because as it turned out, he was good to me. He showed me how to whittle cedar toothpicks with his knife. He let me prowl around in his tool shed, and at Christmas time, every Christmas, Alfred would get a big stick of peppermint. And when I say big, I mean really big. I mean, it was that big around. And after supper every night, I'd stay with him a lot. Alfred would take out his big case knife, turn it over on the back, and he'd whack that peppermint and break off a piece, and he'd hand it to me, and then he'd take a piece. And big as it was, he'd do that every night. By the end of February, he was down to the last little end. He'd crack that in two and share it, and it was gone. Well, let's move forward a little bit to after Grandma Martin left when I was about 4 and a half. By 1956, I was in the 2nd grade, and another Easter event came up. In the 1st grade, we were in a little 3-room building there at the bottom of the hill, and the big school from 3rd through high school was up on the hill, a 1938 WPA sandstone building. But in the 1st grade, we had a little Easter egg hunt, but it was just down there in the play yard of our little 3-room school. Now, the 3-room school, as I said, was 1st grade, then 2nd grade in the middle, then a smaller room on the end, and that was called the slow room. Now, we wouldn't use that term today, but they used it then. If you failed the 1st or 2nd grade, you might get to repeat it, or you might get put in the slow room and nobody wanted to go in there. But in the 2nd grade, we got word that there was going to be the Easter egg hunt to end all Easter egg hunts. It was going to be sponsored by the Dutch Reformed Church next door. It would be at our baseball park, Bond Memorial, and it would involve 1st grade through 6th grade, all of the McKee Elementary students. And the teachers and the people from the church had been planning this apparently for some time, because they had let the grass grow up at the far end of the field down beyond left field and center field really high. And so they said, now this is going to be a really, really big Easter egg hunt, and we'll have eggs of every color, but we'll have one golden egg. And whoever finds the golden egg gets a box full of candy and toys. Whoa, that excited us big time. We all wanted to find the golden egg. Well, the day came around, and we got on the bus, we went up to the ballpark, and they had kept all of the students, 1st grade through 6th, down at the far end of the field, so it'd be fair. And then they started it, all right, go find eggs. Well, I ran out there with the rest of them, and it was not easy. You had to part that big tall grass. It was kind of like parting a giant's hair and looking for something hidden down there. And they had hidden them under rocks and under pieces of paper and behind tree roots. But I found one. I found a red egg, and then later I found a blue egg, and then a green one. But before long, about 30 minutes, some boy in the 6th grade hollered, "Here it is, I found the golden egg." Of course, we were all disappointed that we didn't find it. I never did get to see his box, because apparently they opened it up on the hill where we didn't go. But I never forgot that, and you could say I've been looking for the golden egg ever since. But I've found a few golden eggs, but the way that works, when you find one, you're always looking for the next one. Well, let's move ahead a couple of years from 1956 to 1958. And the Easter of 1958, I was 10 years old. And as usual, Mother and I went to church. Up from the grave he arose, as they always sung it. It was only Mother and I. Dad never went to church with us, but we went to church, and then Mother and I, he never accompanied us, but we went over to Annville, to Grandma Martin's and Alfred's, to have Easter dinner. Today, maybe you'd call it a late lunch, but we called it dinner. And Grandma Martin was a wonderful cook. She made pork chops and bacon and greens and something she called side meat. But her specialty was fried chicken. And on that day we had fried chicken and homemade biscuits and gravy and corn and green beans and fried potatoes, and for dessert, apple pie. And we ate a wonderful meal, and then we headed back home. Well, the next day at school, when I got off from school, I went home and I did what little bit of homework I had, and I told Mother and Dad, I said, I want to go uptown a little bit. And they said, okay, just be home before dark. Now, that wouldn't happen today. You wouldn't turn a child loose. We're much more protected, but in those days, we came and went much more freely. So I walked up in town. It's about a 7 or 8 minute walk. And when I got to the courthouse square, I saw a boy I knew. He was a bit older than me. He was ahead of me in school, but he failed a grade. We ended up being in the same grade together. And his name was Leroy, but they had nicknamed him Beetle Bailey after the comic strip. They called him Beetle. And Beetle was a big, strong, muscular boy. And he was a little mean. You didn't really want to mess with Beetle. But he was up there at the courthouse steps, and all these other boys were gathered around him. And I made my way up there to see what it was that Beetle had that was so interesting. And when I worked my way in, I looked down at his hands, and there he had the cutest baby chick I had ever seen. But she wasn't yellow like a normal chick. She was pink. And that just made her that much more special. And everybody was just fascinated, and Beetle he'd pet her a little bit, and then he'd put her down on the steps and let her run, and then he'd pick her back up. And I was just fascinated by that. After a while, a few of the boys left, but I stuck around, and more time passed, and then Beetle he kind of got bored with just picking her up and down, so he got to sort of throwing her up and catching her. Throw her up and catch her. I was afraid he was going to drop her. He always caught her. Then he'd put her down on the steps, and she'd run and chirp. He'd grab her. And after about 2.5 hours, all the boys had gone home. It was just me and Beetle. And he kept throwing her up in the air. But after a while, that didn't agree with her, and he set her down on the courthouse steps, and she just fell over. And he got her up, and he tried to sort of revive her, but he didn't do much good. But he kept on, and I kept hanging around, and he let her rest a little bit, put her down. She fell down again. And Beetle said, something's wrong with her. And he lost interest in her. He said, I'm going to throw it in the trash can. And I said, well, don't throw it in the trash can. If you don't want it, give it to me. He said, you want it? And I said, yeah. He said, well, here it is. So I got the little pink chick, and I went home just as fast as I could, and I came in and I showed it to Mother and Dad, and I said, look what I've got. And Daddy looked at it, and he said, Mike, there's something wrong with that chick. He said, I don't think that chick's going to make it. And I said, well, can we keep it? I said, maybe it will. And Daddy said, no, I don't, Mike, we don't need a chicken right here in town. And I have to admit, I pulled a trick that I used to pull with Mother and Dad every now and then. I puckered up like I was going to cry. And I stayed with that for just a few seconds, and Daddy would usually be the first one to break, and he said, well, all right, we'll put it in the basement. We'll see how it does for one night. So he got a cardboard box. We put a rag in there for a little pink chick to lay on, a little bowl of water, crumpled up some cornflakes, and then Daddy got a mechanic light that he had, and he put a wash rag around it, plugged it in, turned it on, put it down there to provide a little warmth. And we had supper and went to bed. The next morning, as soon as I got up, I ran down there, and the chick was not walking around, but it was up. It was setting up. Its head wasn't falling over anymore. And so that was encouraging. I put some fresh water and some more cornflakes down there. I went to school. When I came back that evening, it was standing up and walking a little bit. And by the next day, it was walking around just as frisky as it had ever been, as pure, as Granny Norris would say. And so I fed it, and now Mother and Daddy, they hadn't expected it to live. If they had have, they might not have let me keep it, but once they'd committed and it pulled through, they were kind of stuck. Well, I named it Fluffy because of its little fluffy down on its feathers. And they said, well, if you're going to keep that chick, you're going to have to clean its box out and feed it and take care of it. I said, okay, no problem. And so I'd feed it crumpled up cornflakes and Cheerios and shredded wheat. And after about 2 weeks, my favorite cereal at that time was Kellogg's Sugar Frosted Flakes, which is not much more than pure sugar with just a little corn added in. I fed Fluffy some Sugar Frosted Flakes, and Fluffy ate them, and then it ran around that cage just with great hyperactivity for about 20 minutes, and then it flopped over just like it had done before when Beetle had been throwing it up in the air. So I didn't feed it, but it recovered, and I didn't feed it any more Sugar Frosted Flakes. But it kept growing, and before long it needed a bigger box. And I would put newspaper, meaning no offense, the Jackson County Sun or the Lexington Herald Leader, depending on which was handy down in there. And I have to say that Fluffy's digestive system was working very, very well. It was a big job, but I was happy to do it. So before long, school was out, and then the summer wore on. Fluffy had to have a bigger box still. And by the end of the summer, it was not, Fluffy wasn't a chick anymore. It was almost you'd say a young chicken. And Fluffy wasn't as cute as she was originally, because when her feathers grew out, they weren't pink, they were white with pink ends. And she had kind of a punk look to her. I learned on the internet earlier today that in 1998 there was a punk band in England called Fluffy, so that might have been Fluffy might have been a precursor of that group. Well, when school started back, it hadn't been started back many days, till one morning before Mother and Daddy got up at 6:30 as they usually could. It's about 5. We were all awakened by crowing from the basement. And it wasn't loud crowing, but it was loud enough to wake us up. And it turns out that Fluffy wasn't a she as I had thought, but Fluffy was a rooster. And that was a Wednesday, as I recall. And the next morning he woke us up, and the morning Friday he woke us up, and Daddy said that evening, he said, Mike, we can't keep that chicken here and lose sleep. He said, I don't sleep that well anyway. He said, I'm afraid we're going to have to get rid of Fluffy. Well, that kind of threw me into a panic, and I said, well, maybe I can find somebody this weekend to take her. And I contacted some of my friends. A couple of them came down and looked at Fluffy with his white and pink feathers. Nobody wanted Fluffy. Well, Mother mentioned it to my Grandma Martin over in Annville on a phone conversation. And as she did many times in her life, if there was anything that concerned me, she would do something to help. And she said, well, you bring Fluffy over here. We keep chickens. We'll keep Fluffy, can stay with us. So that's what we did. And that Sunday, after church, Mother and I went over there with Fluffy in a box and took him out to where the hen house was and the wire fence around it and put him in there. And Grandma Martin threw some cracked corn down on the ground, and he seemed content enough. And so it looked like we had found a solution to the problem. and that's where Fluffy stayed for the next few weeks. But then I began to hear some disturbing reports about Fluffy. He had continued to grow, and by now he was the biggest rooster in around their hen house, and he started to get mean. And he would peck at Grandma Martin when she'd go to gather eggs, and then later I heard that he had actually tried to flog Alfred. Well, I could tell by the look on Mother's face that wasn't going to work out. But then the bad reports stopped, and I kind of breathed a sigh of relief. I thought, well, Fluffy must have learned to control himself because I'm not hearing anything bad, so I just decided not to rock the boat. A couple of weeks later, Mother and I planned to go over and have Sunday dinner with Grandma Martin and Alfred, and we went over there. And she had her delicious fried chicken and biscuits and gravy and fried potatoes and corn and green beans and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. And after we had eaten, I said, well, how's Fluffy doing? Granny Martin got a look on her face like I had never seen before. She looked embarrassed and nervous, and she looked down at the floor and she said, Fluffy run off. And I said, he run off? Do you think he'll come back? She said, I don't think he will. Well, that was upsetting. And I didn't really enjoy the rest of that day over there. I went down to the chicken coop and I looked all around it, no sign of Fluffy. And we went home. But one thing that was a little consoling was I had just gotten my first dog, a Cocker Spaniel named Rusty. So that soothed my feelings a little bit. And it really wasn't until a couple of years later, and I got a little older, that I realized what had most likely happened to Fluffy. Alfred was a good man, but he was a farm man, and he wouldn't tolerate a flogging chicken. So Fluffy had probably at some point come to Sunday dinner, not as a guest, but as the main course on the table. So we'll move forward to from about 1958, let's go over about a half a century and more, to about 2015, when Minnie Atkins and I were working on the first Mommy Goose book, Rhymes from the Mountains. And one of the rhymes that came through was about a rooster. It's called The Rooster, and it seemed to be coming through in the voice of a little girl. And the little girl was saying, the rooster started pecking at Grandma's legs, then tried to flog Grandpa as he gathered eggs. Grandma boiled water while I churned butter. That night we had fried chicken for supper. Well, Fluffy had been long gone by then, but I think he was still having an influence, and I'll show you how Minnie Atkins represented that. Can you see that rooster attacking Grandpa there? Well, I think it just goes to show that even when something takes hold in your imagination, even if it's no longer alive, it does have a life of its own. So let me just say that this Easter, which as I read, some people think the word Easter comes from the German word for east or dawn. So I hope as the sun dawns tomorrow that you have a happy Easter, and that if you're involved in any hunts, that you find the golden egg. So I think I'll close out with a little bit of the song I did to begin, and you'll see a little more of the meaning now, but I'm going to stop it here and reconfigure. How a kite climbs in the wind, the morning that the girl slept in. Cocktail drew 5 to 10, how the rooster met his end. Tell me, tell me, tell me. So fiddle low, fiddle high, while the dog eats chest pie. The speckled hen goes running by, whatever is in short supply. Tell me, Mommy Goose. Now Mommy's words will stray and fade, but when you call they come at a run. In memory they march on parade, and Mommy names them every one. Let's start out in our old voices. Mommy Goose, Mommy Goose. When she gets a hold, she don't turn loose. You could run away, but what's the use? Listen to Mommy Goose. Tell me, Mommy Goose. Happy Easter.